Sarah sat silently as Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Maybe it's time we figured out a way to help. For years, she had learned not to trust hope too quickly. Hope could be dangerous. Hope could disappoint. Yet something about Daniel and Ethan felt different. There was no judgment in their eyes, no hidden agenda, no expectation of anything in return. Just kindness. Pure, simple kindness. Sarah swallowed hard. "You've already helped me," she said softly. "The dinner was more than enough." Daniel shook his head. "I don't think so." Sarah looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel glanced at Ethan. The boy was watching both of them carefully. "When my wife was alive," Daniel said, "she used to tell me that sometimes people don't need charity." Sarah listened quietly. They need a chance. The words hit her deeply, because that was exactly what she had lost. Not her intelligence, not her skills, not her willingness to work. She had lost opportunities, the chance to start again, the chance to prove herself. Daniel leaned forward. "Do you have any family nearby?" Sarah shook her head. "No." "Friends?" "Most moved away years ago." Daniel nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I know someone who manages a small community housing program." Sarah stared at the card. "I couldn't. Just hear me out." She fell silent. "They help people get temporary housing while they rebuild their lives." Sarah's hands trembled slightly. The idea seemed impossible. After months of uncertainty, the possibility of having a safe place to sleep felt almost unreal. Ethan smiled. "See, I told you everything would work out." Sarah laughed softly. "I wish I had your confidence." "It's easy." "How?" "You just decide things are going to be okay." Daniel laughed. "If only life worked that way." "It does sometimes." The three of them left the restaurant together. Outside, the night air felt different than before. Not colder, not warmer, just different. For the first time in a long time, Sarah wasn't facing the night alone. The following morning, Daniel made several phone calls. By noon, he had arranged a meeting with an old friend named Michael, who worked with a local housing organization. 2 days later, Sarah moved into a small temporary apartment. It wasn't luxurious. The furniture was old, the walls needed paint, the kitchen was tiny. But to Sarah, it felt like a palace. She had a roof over her head, a bed, a door that locked, a place where she could finally sleep without fear. That first night, she cried for nearly an hour. Not from sadness, from relief. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Ethan continued checking on her. Every Saturday they met for coffee or lunch. Little by little, Sarah began feeling like herself again. She cleaned up her resume, applied for jobs, attended interviews. Some employers rejected her, others never called back. Because for the first time in years, she believed there was something worth fighting for. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after their first meeting, Sarah received a phone call. A local elementary school was looking for a substitute teacher. The position wasn't permanent, the salary wasn't amazing, but it was an opportunity, and Sarah grabbed it with both hands. When she entered her classroom on the first day, she nearly cried. The smell of books, the sound of students talking, the sight of desks lined neatly in. Everything felt familiar. Everything felt right. It felt like coming home. Sarah worked harder than ever. Students loved her. Teachers respected her. Administrators noticed her dedication. 6 months later, the school offered her a full-time position. The day she signed the contract, she sat in her car and stared at the paper for nearly 10 minutes. Then she called Daniel. "I got the job." There was silence, then cheering. Lots of cheering, mostly from Ethan. "I knew it!" he shouted through the phone. Sarah laughed through tears. "You did. I told Dad you would. Apparently you were right." Again, Daniel grabbed the phone. "Don't encourage him." Sarah smiled. For the first time in many years, her future looked bright. Months turned into a year. Life continued improving. Sarah moved into her own apartment. She saved money. She rebuilt her confidence. Most importantly, she rediscovered her purpose. One spring afternoon, the elementary school held a special assembly. Teachers, students, and parents filled the auditorium. Sarah stood backstage, waiting for her turn to speak. Her hands shook slightly, not because she was afraid, because she was emotional. In the front row sat Daniel and Ethan. They had no idea what she planned to say. The principal introduced her. Then Sarah walked to the microphone. The room became quiet. She looked out at hundreds of faces. Then her eyes found Ethan. He smiled and waved, just as he had done through the restaurant window a year earlier. Sarah took a deep breath. "I want to tell you a story." The audience listened carefully. "A year ago, I had lost almost everything." The room fell silent. "I had no home, no job, no direction, no hope." People exchanged surprised looks. None of them had known. Sarah continued, "Most people walked past me. They weren't cruel. They were busy. They had their own lives." She paused, then smiled, but one little boy stopped paying attention to himself long enough to notice someone else. Ethan's face turned red. The audience looked toward him. Sarah continued, "He saw a stranger sitting alone. He wondered if she was hungry, and then he asked a question that changed my life." Tears formed in her eyes. The entire auditorium listened. He looked at his father and said. Sarah smiled at Ethan. "Dad, can she eat with us?" Many people wiped away tears, including Daniel. Sarah looked at both of them. That dinner lasted one evening, but the kindness lasted forever. The audience erupted into applause. Some people stood, then more stood, until the entire room was on its feet. A standing ovation. Sarah wasn't being applauded because she had overcome hardship. Daniel wasn't being applauded because he had helped someone. And Ethan wasn't being applauded because he had asked a question. They were being applauded because together they had reminded everyone of something important. A single act of kindness can change a life. Sometimes we imagine changing the world requires something extraordinary, a fortune, a grand gesture, a heroic sacrifice, but often it begins with something much smaller, a conversation, a meal, a seat at a table. After the assembly ended, Sarah walked over to Daniel and Ethan. Without saying a word, she hugged them both. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "We didn't do much." Sarah shook her head. "Yes, you did." Then she looked at Ethan. "You saw me when nobody else did." The boy shrugged. "It seemed obvious." Sarah laughed. Maybe that was the lesson. Kindness often feels obvious to children. The sound that didn't belong. Rain had a way of changing the railroad's voice. Most people noticed only the obvious. The hiss of tires on wet pavement at the crossing. The mournful horn echoing across the river. The long procession of freight cars disappearing into gray distance. To Martin Hale, the weather rearranged every familiar sound into something worth listening to. Moisture softened some vibrations, sharpened others, and coaxed quiet truths from steel that dry afternoons kept hidden. That Tuesday, he wasn't looking for anything unusual. He had spent the morning in the small workshop behind his modest brick house, replacing a cracked capacitor and a portable radio someone from the neighborhood had left on his porch. Tiny drawers filled with screws, resistors, and aging vacuum tubes lined one wall. A kettle whistled softly on a hot plate near the window. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the corrugated metal roof, keeping time with the ticking clock above his workbench. The workshop overlooked the old freight corridor. It wasn't an accident. When Martin retired 6 years earlier after 42 years as a railroad maintenance inspector, friends assumed he'd grow tired of living beside the tracks. Instead, he'd said the trains had become part of the landscape inside him. Silence, he often joked, would have been harder to adjust to than retirement itself. Most afternoons unfolded the same way. Repair a radio, sand a wooden cabinet, water the tomatoes growing beside the fence, pause when the eastbound freight rolled past. Listen, not because he expected trouble, because he never quite stopped listening. At precisely 2:17 p.m., the crossing lights a quarter-mile away began flashing through the drizzle. Martin looked up from the open radio. He closed his eyes before the locomotive even appeared. The deep diesel rumble arrived first, rolling beneath the floorboards like distant thunder. Moments later came the rhythmic percussion of steel wheels striking expansion joints farther down the line. Then the familiar procession began. Clack, 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 steady, measured, comfortingly predictable. Martin smiled faintly without realizing it. His hands continued tightening a tiny brass screw, while his ears followed the passing train. Then, something interrupted the rhythm. Not loudly, not violently, just a delicate, metallic pulse, a faint high note buried beneath tons of moving steel. Tick. 3 seconds. Tick. Another pause. Tick. Martin stopped turning the screwdriver. The sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The train continued west without hesitation, boxcars trailing into the rain until only the flashing crossing signals remained. For several seconds, Martin stayed perfectly still. He wasn't alarmed. He was uncertain. He replayed the sound in his mind the way musicians replay a missed note after a concert. It hadn't been imagination. He reached for the small notebook that always rested beside his coffee mug. Its pages weren't journals or personal reflections. They were filled with observations. Bird migrations, weather patterns, locomotive numbers he happened to notice, and the occasional sketch of machinery that caught his attention. He drew 4 short marks across the page. Underneath, he wrote only 3 words. Every third rotation. He stared at the note for a long moment before closing the notebook. Then he laughed quietly to himself. "You're retired, Martin." The empty workshop offered no reply. That evening, the rain eased into a cool mist that drifted across the rail yard several miles away. Martin carried a bag of groceries home from the neighborhood market, exchanging brief greetings with familiar faces. "Still fixing those old radios?" asked Mr. Delgado, who owned the hardware store. "Somebody has to keep them talking. You ought to slow down." Martin smiled politely. "I've been trying for 6 years." People often confused retirement with rest. Martin had discovered they were different things. He no longer climbed bridges carrying inspection gear or walked miles of track beneath summer heat, but his days were rarely idle. Habits built over decades didn't disappear because paperwork said they should. He still folded every shirt with military precision, still checked weather forecasts before sunrise, still noticed loose fence hinges while walking down ordinary streets, still listened. Sometimes that felt less like a skill than a condition. After dinner, he settled onto the porch with an old photo album his daughter had insisted he keep, instead of storing in boxes. Most photographs weren't of family vacations. They showed bridges, switchyards, maintenance crews posing awkwardly beside freshly repaired rails, snowstorms, flooded embankments, a younger Martin standing beside men whose names fewer people remembered every year. One photograph stopped him. 31 years earlier, late autumn, a steel bridge crossing the Ash River. The image itself looked ordinary until he noticed a penciled note on the back. Harmonic vibration traced after rain, rare, monitor closely. Martin frowned. The handwriting was unmistakably his. He couldn't immediately remember the incident itself. That bothered him. His memory usually held railroad details with surprising clarity. He closed the album and walked into the workshop. Against the far wall stood several weathered archive boxes his daughter constantly encouraged him to throw away. Instead, he'd labeled every one: North Division, bridge reports, track geometry, incident logs, inspection notes. He lifted the oldest box onto the workbench. Dust drifted through the beam of a hanging lamp. For nearly an hour he searched quietly. Paper after paper, inspection forms, bridge sketches, maintenance requests, coffee-stained diagrams. Most people would have seen clutter. Martin saw conversations between workers separated by years, a note in blue ink answering another written in black. Corrections, measurements, questions, solutions. Near the bottom of the box, he found a faded field notebook wrapped with a cracked rubber band. Its cover had nearly worn smooth. Inside were handwritten entries from the autumn shown in the photograph. His eyes moved carefully across each page. Weather, load weights, rail temperatures, bridge expansion measurements. Then, one sentence. Only 7 words. High metallic pulse every third wheel cycle. Martin's breathing slowed. He read it again. Exactly the pattern he'd heard that afternoon. Not similar. Exact. His fingers remained resting on the yellowed page, while rain whispered softly against the workshop roof. He remembered fragments now, not the entire investigation, just pieces. Standing beneath a bridge with another inspector whose laugh carried farther than anyone else's, holding a mechanic's stethoscope against cold steel, waiting through 3 freight trains before hearing the sound again. After that, nothing. The memory dissolved like fog. He leaned back in his chair. Why can't I remember the ending? The question lingered in the dim workshop. Outside, another freight train rolled through the darkness. Martin instinctively listened. This time, everything sounded ordinary, solid, balanced, exactly as it should, which somehow unsettled him even more, because if today's sound had been real, then it hadn't followed the train. It belonged to something else. He looked once more at the faded notebook. The final page had been folded inward years ago. Carefully, almost reluctantly, he unfolded it. Inside was a rough pencil sketch of a bridge support, a handwritten measurement, and a sentence underlined twice. "Don't ignore what the instruments can't explain." Martin stared at those words until the workshop grew completely quiet. He couldn't remember writing them, but he remembered believing them. Echoes beneath the steel. Martin barely slept. The faded notebook remained open on his kitchen table long after midnight, its yellowed pages illuminated by a single lamp, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Every few minutes, he reread the same sentence. "Don't ignore what the instruments can't explain." He wished he could remember why he had written it. Instead, fragments surfaced and disappeared like reflections in moving water. A younger version of himself crouched beneath a bridge, voices calling measurements across steel beams, someone saying, "Listen again." But the rest remained locked away. By sunrise, the rain had eased into a fine mist. Martin poured black coffee into an old metal thermos, slipped the notebook into his jacket, and drove toward the railroad crossing where he had heard the strange vibration. The crossing sat between harvested cornfields and a narrow river lined with cottonwoods. It wasn't remarkable. The paint on the signal cabinet had faded, weeds pushed through cracks in the gravel shoulder, and a small diner across the road had just switched on its neon open sign. A waitress sweeping the entrance recognized him. "Morning, Martin." "Morning, Linda. You waiting on somebody?" He glanced toward the tracks. "Just listening." She smiled politely. Around town, people had learned not to ask too many questions when Martin gave answers like that. At 8:42 a.m., the first freight train arrived. Martin stood several yards from the rails, hands tucked into his coat pockets. The locomotive thundered past, shaking damp leaves from nearby trees. One by one, loaded hopper cars followed, their wheels singing against polished steel. He closed his eyes. The rhythm flowed through him. Wheel, joint, wheel, joint. Everything sounded clean, no unusual pulse, no metallic tick. When the train disappeared around a distant bend, Martin opened his notebook and wrote only 2 words. "Nothing today." He didn't leave. Old railroad lessons had taught him that problems rarely appeared on command. Sometimes they waited. The second freight arrived shortly after noon. This one was heavier, longer. Its engines worked harder, climbing the gentle grade west of the crossing. Martin heard it before he saw it. The deep diesel roar echoed across the wet fields, blending with the steady chirp of crickets hidden in the grass. Again he listened. The first 10 cars passed normally. Then, tick. A faint metallic vibration. 3 seconds. Tick. Another pause. Tick. There it was. Not imagination, not memory. The exact same rhythm. Martin stepped closer. Not dangerously close, but enough to feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. He counted silently. The pulse appeared only after the train reached a certain speed, then vanished before the final cars cleared the crossing. Interesting. Very interesting. He wrote quickly. Loaded train. Wet rail. Speed approximately 45. Harmonic returns. He underlined the final word once. Back home, Martin searched the internet for the Regional Rail Operations Office. Everything had changed since his retirement. Digital reporting systems, online maintenance requests, automated track monitoring networks. In his day, inspectors still carried notebooks. Now computers carried nearly everything. After navigating 3 phone menus, a young voice answered. "Regional Infrastructure Operations, this is Daniel speaking." Martin introduced himself. "I retired from North Division Maintenance 6 years ago." Daniel sounded genuinely friendly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" Martin explained carefully. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts. "I've heard a repeating harmonic vibration on 2 loaded freight movements during wet conditions." There was a pause while keys clicked on a keyboard. "I'm checking today's sensor reports." Martin waited. No irregular wheel temperatures. Another pause. No bearing alerts. More typing. Track geometry normal. Daniel cleared his throat. "Everything looks healthy from what I'm seeing." "I expected that." "I'm sorry? Harmonics don't always show themselves the same way." Daniel hesitated. I'm not saying you're wrong, sir. It's just, we've got acoustic monitors, vibration sensors, wheel impact detectors. If there were a significant issue, I know what you've got. Martin kept his voice calm. I've read about most of it. Another silence settled between them. Finally, Daniel said gently, if you'd like, I can file an observation report. I'd appreciate that. We'll log it. Martin thanked him before ending the call. He didn't feel dismissed. Not exactly. Daniel had been respectful, professional, but Martin recognized the quiet confidence of someone who trusted data more than instinct. He couldn't blame him. If he were 30 years younger, he might have done the same. Martin drove farther down the line. Instead of watching trains pass, he walked beneath an aging steel bridge spanning the Ash River. Cold air drifted beneath the girders. Water moved slowly below, carrying fallen branches after the recent rain. Martin rested one hand against a massive support beam. Steel always held stories, not mystical ones, physical ones. Tiny scratches, fresh rust, water stains, heat marks from old repairs. A structure remembered everything that had happened to it. You only needed to know how to read it. A buzzing sound interrupted his thoughts. He looked up. A small inspection drone hovered beneath the bridge before rising toward the tracks above. Moments later, footsteps crunched across loose gravel. A woman wearing a bright orange safety vest approached, carrying a rugged tablet under one arm. She appeared to be in her early 30s. Practical boots, hard hat tucked beneath one hand, curious expression. You've been standing here almost 20 minutes, she said with a polite smile. Martin nodded. I suppose I have. I'm Sophia Ramirez. She pointed toward the drone disappearing overhead. Signal systems. Martin Hale. Recognition flickered across her face. The maintenance inspector? Former. My supervisor mentioned your phone call yesterday. Martin sighed quietly. So word travels. It does on railroads. She leaned against the bridge railing, looking out over the river. What exactly are you hearing? He searched for words. It isn't one sound. She waited patiently. It's several sounds lining up in the wrong way. She frowned thoughtfully. Like an echo? No, he shook his head. Like several musicians playing correctly but somehow creating the wrong note together. Sophia considered that. Instead of dismissing the explanation, she asked another question. When does it happen? Wet weather. Heavily loaded trains. Speed matters. She opened her tablet. I've never heard anyone describe vibration like music. Martin smiled faintly. It is music. She looked toward the rails overhead. I usually trust numbers. You should. But they don't always tell you which question to ask. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Wind moved gently through the bridge framework, producing a low, humming tone that shifted with each gust. Sophia finally broke the silence. Would you mind showing me exactly where you first noticed it? They spent the afternoon driving between crossings. Martin never rushed. He pointed out subtle changes in track elevation, drainage ditches, older welds hidden beneath newer repairs. None of it proved anything. Yet Sophia noticed something unexpected. Martin wasn't guessing. Every observation came from decades of accumulated patterns. He rarely used dramatic words. Instead, he spoke in probabilities, possibilities, connections. As the afternoon faded, Sophia stopped beside a maintenance access gate and opened archived infrastructure records on her tablet. She scrolled quietly. Bridge inspections, repair histories, structural modifications. Then her eyes narrowed. That's odd. Martin looked over. What is? She turned the screen toward him. 31 years ago, this bridge underwent a reinforcement project. Martin recognized the date immediately. The same year as his notebook. The report says one support assembly wasn't replaced. Why? It says updated calculations determined replacement wasn't necessary. Martin read the engineering notes carefully. Nothing suggested negligence. The decision had been reasonable, based on the information available then. Sophia looked at him. Think there's a connection? Martin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gazed up at the bridge disappearing into the evening mist. I don't know, he paused, but I know one thing. What? I've heard this sound before. The wind carried a distant locomotive horn across the valley. Both of them looked instinctively toward the tracks above. Neither spoke, because for the first time, they were listening for the same thing. Chapter 3. The Weight Carried in Silence. The first freight train of the morning crossed the bridge just after sunrise. Martin and Sophia stood on the riverbank below, wrapped in heavy jackets against the cool autumn air. A pale mist drifted above the water, softening the outlines of the steel structure overhead. As the locomotives rumbled across the bridge, vibrations traveled through the beams like a slow heartbeat. Martin didn't watch the train. He listened. The first dozen cars rolled across with the familiar rhythm he'd known for most of his life. Then it came. Tick, a pause. Tick, another pause. The faint metallic pulse echoed through the bridge's framework before disappearing beneath the roar of the freight. Sophia heard it this time. Her eyes widened, not with panic, but with recognition. "I heard it," she said quietly. Martin nodded without looking at her. "I know." Neither of them spoke again until the last car disappeared beyond the trees. Later that morning, Sophia arranged a meeting with the district engineering supervisor. She didn't describe the issue as an emergency. She simply requested permission for a focused structural inspection. The supervisor, Richard Owens, had worked on the railroad for nearly 30 years himself. Unlike some younger managers, he understood that experience sometimes noticed things before computers did. He listened carefully as Sophia explained what she and Martin had observed. When she finished, Richard folded his arms. "Our sensors haven't flagged anything." "I know." "Our bridge inspections are current." "I know. So why should I close part of my schedule for another inspection?" Sophia hesitated. "Because someone who spent 4 decades listening to railroads says something has changed." Richard looked toward Martin, who had remained silent throughout the meeting. Finally he asked, "What do you think we're looking for?" Martin answered honestly, "I don't know yet." Richard smiled slightly. "That's not the answer engineers usually like." "No, but it's the truthful one." After several thoughtful seconds, Richard nodded. "One inspection." He pointed a finger toward Martin. "If we don't find anything, you owe my crew coffee." Martin smiled for the first time that day. "That's a deal." By early afternoon, maintenance trucks lined the access road near the bridge. Workers unloaded equipment with the practiced rhythm of people who had done difficult jobs together for years. Hydraulic jacks, inspection lights, ultrasonic testing equipment, portable scanners. The bridge remained open, but train traffic slowed while crews examined the support structure beneath the tracks. Martin stayed out of the way. Retirement had taught him something important. Knowing when not to interfere was just as valuable as knowing when to speak. Instead, he watched quietly from the riverbank. Sophia moved among the crew, checking measurements against archived engineering drawings. Hours passed. Nothing unusual appeared. One technician climbed down from a support beam and shrugged. "Looks clean." Another reviewed scan results. No fractures. Richard glanced toward Martin with an apologetic expression. "Looks like your coffee bill is getting expensive." Martin simply nodded. "Maybe." But something continued bothering him. Not the inspection, the bridge itself. He walked slowly beneath the structure, running his eyes across every beam and connection, the same way he had thousands of times throughout his career. Not searching, observing. Then he stopped. Halfway up one support column sat a weathered protective access plate, secured by 4 heavy bolts. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Martin frowned. "Richard." The supervisor walked over. "What is it? Has anyone checked behind that plate?" Richard looked upward. "It protects an expansion assembly." "I know. It isn't part of today's inspection." Martin remained quiet for several moments. Then he said softly, "Would you mind?" Richard studied his face. Years in railroad work had taught him that experienced inspectors rarely pointed at something without reason. He signaled 2 mechanics. A portable lift rolled into position. Within minutes, the bolts began coming loose. Metal scraped softly against metal as the protective plate was lowered to the platform. Everyone leaned closer. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then one mechanic ran his flashlight across the assembly. The beam caught a section of polished steel. Not painted. Not rusty. Bright, smooth, fresh. Richard climbed onto the lift himself. He reached out and touched the surface. "It's been rubbing." Another engineer frowned. "It shouldn't even be able to move that far." Silence settled. Not dramatic silence, but the quiet concentration of professionals realizing they had found something unexpected. Martin remained below, watching their expressions rather than the machinery itself. He already knew what they had discovered. Not because he was smarter, because he had heard it. Over the next 2 days, engineers performed a complete structural analysis. The results surprised everyone. The bridge wasn't in immediate danger. It wasn't close to collapse. But years of tiny movements, too small for individual sensors to classify as significant, had gradually shifted part of the expansion assembly. During heavy freight movements, wet conditions, and specific temperatures, two massive steel components touched each other for fractions of a second. That contact produced the metallic pulse Martin had recognized. Individually, every sensor reading had remained within acceptable limits. Together, they had been telling a story no computer had assembled. Repairs began immediately. Traffic was temporarily rerouted while crews replaced worn components and realigned the support system. The work took nearly 3 weeks. Few travelers noticed. Most simply experienced slightly delayed freight schedules. The railroad preferred it that way. Good maintenance rarely made headlines. One crisp November afternoon, Sophia drove to Martin's workshop carrying a long cardboard box. He looked up from an old tabletop radio as she knocked. "I thought the bridge would be keeping you busy." "It is," she smiled. "But I wanted to bring you something." Inside the box lay several freshly printed binders. Across each cover appeared the title, Field Observation Archive, Martin Hale. He looked at her, confused. "My notebooks?" "All of them?" "Every page." Martin carefully opened the first binder. His old sketches had been cleaned and preserved digitally. Handwritten notes appeared beside modern engineering diagrams. Coffee stains had vanished. The words remained. Sophia leaned against the workbench. "The training department asked if they could use your field notes for new inspectors." Martin looked up slowly. "Mine?" "They said your reports explain something our software can't." "What?" She smiled. How experienced people notice patterns before numbers explain them. For a long moment, Martin didn't know what to say. He had never expected awards, never wanted recognition. He had simply done his job. Apparently, that had been enough. Several weeks later, the repaired bridge reopened fully. Martin parked his pickup on a small hill overlooking the valley. A thermos of coffee rested beside him. The afternoon sun broke through scattered clouds, casting warm light across the freshly painted steel. In the distance, an eastbound freight approached. The locomotives crossed the bridge with steady confidence. One by one, the loaded cars followed. Martin listened. The familiar rhythm returned. Steel against steel, wheel after wheel, balanced, consistent. No hidden pulse, no unanswered question, just the ordinary music of a railroad doing exactly what it was built to do. He allowed himself a small smile, not because he had been right, because the bridge was. As the last freight car disappeared beyond the horizon, Martin stood quietly for another minute before returning to his truck. Back in his workshop that evening, he placed the worn field notebook beside the new binders Sophia had brought him. For years, he had believed those pages were simply records of work already finished. Now he understood they were something else. A conversation, one generation speaking to the next. He switched off the workshop lights and stepped outside. Another train rolled through the night, its steady rhythm drifting across the neighborhood. Martin paused on the porch, closed his eyes, and listened one last time. Everything sounded exactly as it should. Satisfied, he locked the workshop door and walked slowly toward home. Behind him, the railroad carried its endless procession of freight into the darkness, its greatest guardian never seeking applause, only the quiet assurance that the sound of steel told an honest story. And somewhere, in the cab of a passing locomotive, beneath the hum of diesel engines and the rhythm of turning wheels, another generation traveled safely across a bridge because one retired railroad worker had never forgotten how to listen.